Hello, my name is Steve O'Reilly, and welcome to Roma Locuta Est Considers. What is RomaLocutaEst.com? You may very well ask yourself. It's a wee humble blog that the world little notes, nor will it long remember, but it is devoted to apologetics and commentary on Catholic topics, current events, and general Christian apologetics. We here at Roma Locuta Est do not seek, nor do we accept donations. No funding is received from any other source. We're beholden to no one, and we alone are responsible for the content. So this is now episode 5 of Roma Locuta Est Considers. We continue our discussion of Benepapism, the Munus versus the Ministerium. This is part 4 of 5. The material for this series has been based on articles from RomaLocutaEst.com, as well as from my book, Valid, The Resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, The Case Against the Benepapists. Okay, so let's dive into it. For those who might just be joining this series, I really recommend that you go back to the beginning, episode 1, when we first start diving into the whole question of Benepapism and the Declaratio, but here I'm just going to kind of give a brief recap for the folks who have been following along. We have the Declaratio, which is Benedict's instrument of resignation. The key part we have been focusing on over the last few parts is where Benedict declared, where he said, "I declare that I renounce the ministry," or ministerio is the Latin, of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. And the crux of the matter is that Benedict used the word ministerio, but the Benepapists are quick to point out that Canon 332, subparagraph 2, speaks of if it should happen that the Roman Pontiff resigns his office, and there the canon uses the Latin word munus, and so the Benepapists say, look, in the Declaratio, Benedict used the word ministerio. He renounced or resigned the ministerio, but in the canon it says he uses or should use the word munus. So that's kind of where we started off on our analysis in response to the Benepapist objections. So with regard to the question of the munus versus the ministerio, there are basically 3 general objections that are raised by the Benepapists. The first is Pope Benedict did not specifically renounce the munus. Okay, we've already addressed it. That was in part 1, episode 2. And as we saw in that episode, the net result was we could reject the Benepapist objection because their objection fails when put under the light of keen and diligent analysis. So we're currently now looking at the second objection. That's currently the subject of this several-part series. And here the objection is an appropriate word or words were not used in place of the munus. So here the Benepapists agree that other words besides munus can be used, but those words must entail the meaning of munus. So for example, the Benepapists would agree here that the word papacy could be used in a resignation. So if a pope were to say, "I renounce the papacy," that would be a valid resignation because it entails the word munus. We've already looked at this in parts 2 and 3, and now this is the 4th part of our look at this particular objection. Okay, so again, our objection 2 is an appropriate word or words that were not used in place of the munus. And as we saw earlier in our response to this specific objection, we had first noted that authoritative reference materials demonstrate that Ministerium is a suitable substitute for munus in the Declaratio. We looked, for example, at Lewis and Short's Latin dictionary, wherein it's explicitly stated that Ministerium is a synonym of munus. And then we also looked at Stelton's Dictionary of Ecclesiastical Latin, and then we looked at the entries for munus and ministerium there, and it's clear that the definitions overlap. So we clearly have words here that are suitable substitutes. We next looked at Benedict's Declaratio, his instrument of resignation, and its entry in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, which is the official journal or chronicle of the Holy See. The title of that document in the AAS speaks of the abdication of the office, the Munus, of the Bishop of Rome. That's in the title of the document, the Declaratio of the AAS. So you have the title that says that, and then below it, it speaks of the renunciation of the Ministerium, of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. So the title gives us to understand how the text should be understood, and clearly it is saying that the text is speaking in effect and actually of the abdication of the Munus of the Bishop of Rome. And then most recently, in the episode right before this one, we took a look at the dogmatic constitution from Vatican II, which is Lumen Gentium. And in that, we looked at the third chapter on the hierarchy of the church. And in sections 18 through 20, we were able to clearly see that a munus is a ministry, and that the Petrine Ministerium entails the Petrine Munus. So I certainly strongly recommend that folks take a look at the last episode. So taking a look at those three responses, either individually or collectively, it's clear that the objection failed miserably. But yet, even so, even though the objection has failed, we're going to take a look at one more aspect of this whole debate. And what I'd like to take a look at, I think it'd be interesting to look at papal titles or references to the papacy, which entail the Petrine Munus. So, as we've already seen in the prior analysis, the Petrine ministry or ministerium entails the Petrine office or munus. And we've seen in the AAS, in the title of it, it speaks of the abdication of the munus of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, whereas in the text immediately following in the AAS, in the body of the Declaratio, it speaks of the renunciation of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. So clearly you have the title and the text pointing one to the other, and it's clear that the meanings are synonymous. There, the munus of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, is going to be synonymous with the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. So that sparked some interest on in my mind as to are there other uses of ministry as a reference or perhaps a title to the papacy. So I did take a look back and see if there's anything that might shed some light on what we've reviewed thus far. So I wanted to go back and look at the last few popes just to see if there's any mentions of Ministerium in any documents related to them. So I went back, I started with John Paul I, and I think I found some things I thought at least were interesting. In olden days, just in terms of a little brief history, in olden days, there would be a coronation mass to mark the occasion of a new pontiff assuming the throne of St. Peter. Now, under John Paul I, the title of that Mass was the Holy Mass for the inauguration of the Petrine ministry of the Bishop of Rome. Now, that's the English translation of the Italian, Santa Messa per l'inizio del Ministero Petrino del Vescovo di Roma. So the Petrine ministry of the Bishop of Rome. Now, granted, that is in Italian and not Latin. So again, as I noted on the prior slide, that The English translation speaks of the inauguration of the Petrine ministry of the Bishop of Rome. The Italian, again, not the Latin, but the Italian says Ministero Petrino here. But if you get into the homily itself of John Paul I's homily from his inauguration mass, he speaks of the ministry of the supreme pastor of the church, and the minister. I'm sorry, he uses the ministry of the supreme pastor of the church, and here's the Latin down here, where he uses the word ministry right in here, Ministerium. So that's certainly the sense of the title in English and the Italian of a sense of ministerium, and not specifically the word munus for the translation. But in his homily, John Paul I, he speaks of, in this sacred celebration, inaugurating the ministry of the supreme pastor of the church, which has been placed on our shoulders. We begin by turning our mind in adoration and prayer to the infinite and eternal God, who has raised us to the chair of Blessed Peter by his own design. So here he's using ministry and speaking of being the authority of being placed on the shoulders and being raised to the chair of St. Peter. And then in another document in his very short papacy, pontificate, which lasted roughly a month, we have John Paul I speaking of the papacy, says, our mind is still disturbed when we think of the fearful ministry to which we have been chosen. So here he's obviously speaking of his election, and the Latin here is ministero, so he's referring to the fearful ministry to which he's been chosen, to which he's been elected. So then that brings us to John Paul II. Now these are just some examples. Others can be found for John Paul I and John Paul II. But in these documents here are all found in the AAS. So here I found a document, again in the AAS, from the Master of Pontifical Ceremonies, and he's speaking of the upcoming schedule of events, and here he speaks of to make the solemn beginning of the ministry of the Supreme Pastor. So again, he's speaking of the assumption of the new Pope to the throne of St. Peter. So we're talking about the papacy here. And then here's the Latin of what I just read in English. So again, you have the use of ministry right down here, ministerium in the Latin. And then there's another, I think later on in the same document, the Master of Ceremonies again is writing in English, talking about solemnly beginning the ministry of the High Shepherd, and then in the Latin, the use of ministerium here, the summi pastoris ministerium. So again, we're talking about the beginning of the papacy of John Paul II. And then the next example comes from, I believe it's the homily at John Paul II's first Mass, and this would be said with the cardinals present, I believe in the Sistine Chapel. But here he's speaking of, we must show a fidelity with our strength, indeed must be carried out by the fact that we keep the deposit of faith intact, by the fact that we do exactly the particular commands of Christ, who to Simon the Rock of the church, once established, he delivered the keys to the kingdom, and he gives the citation there from, or the citation is given there from Matthew 16, 18 through 19, which commanded him to strengthen his brothers, again a reference to another verse in Scripture, Luke 22, 32, and to feed the sheep and the lambs of the flock for testimony of love. And again, that's to reference to John 21, 15 through 17. We are absolutely convinced, so here's the key part here, we are absolutely convinced that in research that is being done today about the ministry of Peter, he puts it in quotes as they call it, so that it is proper and special to him, can be seen more clearly day by day, these three key points of the Holy Gospel cannot be overlooked. So here he's relating all three of the Petrine verses to the ministry of Peter in a Mass celebrating his ascension to the throne of his rising to the throne of Saint Peter. So again, we got here a reference to the papacy, and again here is the Latin of what I just read, Ministerium Petri down here. Okay, so that brings us up to Pope Benedict XVI, and like his immediate predecessors, the Mass to mark his assumption of the papacy, we have it called the solemn or have it spoken of as the solemn commencement of the ministry of the Supreme Pastor of the Church, and I just put the Latin in for that right here. And again, you see ministry or ministerium is inserted in there. So again, a Mass marking Benedict's rise to the throne of St. Peter uses ministry of the Supreme Pastor of the Church. Okay, so then Pope Benedict, on the day following his election, I believe is when the Mass is held, he gave a Mass. So all the cardinals would be present for this. This Mass is said in the Sistine Chapel, and he was speaking in Latin, and he spoke of the Eucharist, the heart of the Christian life, and the source of good news of the Church is an essential and permanent and central part of the Petrine ministry. And here he used the Latin. Here he uses a form of ministerium. So a central part of the Petrine ministry entrusted to us. So again, he's speaking there of his election, and what is he being elected to? He's being elected to the Petrine ministry, which he accepted. That's what's entrusted to him. So again, here we're speaking obviously of the papacy. Then, of course, still speaking of Benedict, of course, we have his Declaratio, where he speaks of, I renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, entrusted to me. So again, that refers back, the entrust to me is a clear reference to his election, and indeed, he says here, entrusted to me by the cardinals on April 19th, 2005. That's obviously the conclave that elected him. So what was he entrusted with? The ministry of St. Peter, the Petrine ministry, and that's what he used on the Mass the day following his election, speaking of the Petrine ministry entrusted to us. He's speaking of the papacy entrusted to him. And here's the Latin from the Declaratio down here. And again, it's ministry or ministerium or ministerio is used with the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, and then the speaks of the cardinals that had committed or entrusted the ministry of St. Peter to him at the conclave. And of course, lastly, that brings us back to the AAS, where the Declaratio was entered into the AAS, the official chronicle journal of the Holy See, and the title of the document there speaks of the abdication of the Munus of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, and clearly that's synonymous with the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. And I think what we can see across all of these examples is that ministerium is being used in various forms. The ministry of the chief pastor, the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, and so forth. So we're clearly seeing that in various titles, how you want to call them, or references at least, certainly, we're speaking of the references to the papacy, we're speaking of the papacy. And now we come to an interesting canon, Canon 27, which reads, "Custom is the best interpreter of the law." And for an interpretation of it, I turn to the new commentary on the Code of Canon Law by John Beale et al. And just also a quick shout out here to Father John Rickert, who actually brought Canon 27 to my attention. But from that commentary, the Beale commentary, it speaks of the interpretation treated in this canon is better understood as interpretation in practice, rather than the technical interpretation of a law's meaning treated in canons 17 and 18. Curiously, we will do an episode on Canon 17 when I'm finished with the Munus and Ministerium. So again, Canon 27, we're talking about interpretation in practice rather than a technical interpretation of the law's meaning. And that's where the Benepapists tie themselves up in knots trying to restrict the meaning of Munus. As we'll see in a later episode on Canon 17, we'll see how they try to do that. But they try to restrict the meaning, but it's clear, not that we have a ton of examples in church history of resignations, papal resignations. I mean, there have been some. But we take, for example, the resignation of Celestine V, which left behind some canon law. And the question is that he resigned the papacy, using the word papacy. And then in Benedict's case, he used the word ministry of, or the words, the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, which clearly is, as we've looked at all along here, is synonymous with the papacy. If he had meant something unique or other than the papacy, surely he would have told us that beforehand, but he did not. He did not, because he did not mean anything other than the papacy. Many Benepapists will say, well, he meant only a partial resignation, or he only meant, for example, to resign the act of doing of the papacy and not the papacy itself in terms of an office. So they claim if he intended any such nonsense, clearly Benedict would have left us a teaching document beforehand saying, hey, I only mean to resign half the papacy and not the whole papacy. But he didn't do that. And it's clear from these examples that we've seen in this response so far that ministry of the Bishop of Rome is referring to the papacy. And just to underline that point, I just point to our prior analysis where we looked again at Lumen Gentium 18 through 20, and we looked at the AAS, the official entry of the Declaratio there. It's clear that a Munus is a ministerium, and the Petrine Ministerium entails the Munus. So it's clear that we're talking about the papacy if we use either term, ministry or Munus. Okay, so then we've also looked at the various forms of Petrine ministry used in papal masses. For example, we've seen that for the last three popes, speaking of the inauguration of the Petrine ministry or some form of that, the ministry of the chief or supreme pastor of the church. We've seen it in various other documents in the AAS, including papal homilies, where they're using Petrine ministry of the papacy, or other documents such as those of masters of ceremonies talking about scheduling the masses being masses to inaugurate the Petrine ministry. So clearly these terms used on such occasions, especially when you're talking about the inauguration of a papacy or inauguration of the Petrine ministry, we're speaking of occasions which are synonymous, or references that are synonymous with the papacy. During these masses, the the new pope is invested with symbols of authority like the pallium and the fisherman's ring. So clearly these references are to the papacy, and if such terms are used, and if such terms are used in practice at the inauguration of a papacy, as they were in the case of the last three popes, it should not be a surprise that Benedict would have used that term or terminology in his renunciation of the papacy. It was used at the beginning of his papacy, and it should come as no surprise that he used it to end his papacy in his Declaratio. Okay, so let's kind of sum up the state of play here against, in our reply against objection 2. Again, the objection was an appropriate word or words were not used in place of the munus. Well, what we've seen here overall is words such as I renounce the papacy are sufficient for a valid resignation. That's clear from the Liber Sextus. And we also conceive from that, therefore, that the papacy entails the munus. We've also seen that the word ministerium is undoubtedly a synonym for the word munus, no matter what the Benepapists say. We've looked at authoritative reference materials such as Lewis and Short, and we looked at Stelton's Dictionary of Ecclesiastical Latin, and it's clear from both the one explicitly says, Lewis and Short explicitly says, it's a synonym, and in Stelton we looked at the definitions side by side, and it's clear they overlap. And then, again, we just spoke of it a few minutes ago. We saw in our analysis of Lumen Gentium 18 through 20, but specifically in Lumen Gentium 20, we saw from our analysis there that a munus is a ministerium. So again, proving that a ministry entails a munus. And then, as we have mentioned, that the title of the Declaratio in the AAS, it speaks of the abdication of the munus of the Bishop of Rome. The text below it speaks of a renunciation of the Ministerium of the Bishop of Rome, or ministry. So you have the title, the text below. The title gives us to understand gives us to know how we should understand the text below, and from that it must be understood that the renunciation of the Ministerium of the Bishop of Rome is to be understood as renunciation of the munus of the Bishop of Rome. Okay, and then again looking at Lumen Gentium here, sections 18 through 20, as well as looking at the AAS, which we just saw in the bullet right above here. The Petrine Ministerium entails the Petrine munus, and thus it also entails the papacy itself. And then, as we saw earlier in this episode, we saw many examples where the ministerium has been incorporated into titles or references to the papacy, John Paul I, JP2, Benedict XVI, on such occasions as the Mass is inaugurating the Pope, when he officially assumes the chair of St. Peter, and when he receives the symbols of papal authority, which include the pallium and the fisherman's ring. We saw that in various examples of masses which inaugurate the Petrine ministry of the Bishop of Rome in at least three cases. And then, having looked at these former examples of the last three popes of masses inaugurating the Petrine ministry or some similar term used in the title of the masses or in homilies in the masses or in homilies of masses of the Mass the next day after the election in the Sistine Chapel, such examples as that. And then if we look at Benedict's use of the ministry or Ministerium of the Bishop of Rome in his own Declaratio, it's clear that those words are similar to these aforementioned titles or references to the papacy. So having viewed all that, and given that custom is the best interpreter of the law per Canon 27, and we just saw some of these recent customs of using terms with or titles or references to the papacy using various forms of ministerium, that's become a custom. And if we look at the custom of what happened under Celestine V, so given all the above, or in consideration of all the above, then Benedict XVI's renunciation of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome entails the renunciation of the papacy, and thus the Petrae Munus. Consequently, Benedict's resignation is valid. Okay, so given all that, and given our conclusion here that the renunciation of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome entails the renunciation of the papacy, and thus the Petrae Munus, consequently, Benedict's resignation is valid. Therefore, the objection fails. Okay, so that concludes our replies to objection 2. There's still one more objection to look at here in this series on the Munus versus the Ministerium. Before I go, I would just like to remind you that on RomaLocutaEst.com we have various compilations of articles that look closely at Benepapism and provide responses to pretty much all their objections that they have ever had. These articles and additional research in turn became the basis of my book here on Your Right. I'm honored to say that Bishop Athanasius Schneider wrote the foreword for it. The book is available on Amazon and other fine distributors. And so in addition to my book and the blog, Roma Locuta Est, there are other fine articles out there that take on and argue against the Benepapist position. I'd recommend you take a look at Ryan Grant's article on the topic. It appears in 1 Peter 5. And Father John Rickert, FSSP, he has 4 articles, very fine articles, that appear on the wmbriggs.com website. I recommend that you take a close look at those. And then also Dr. Edward Fieser has at least a couple articles out that I'm aware of. Please take a look at all of those. In addition to my articles on Roma Locuta Est and my book against Benepapism, I also write fiction. I'm working on a trilogy now called Pia Fidelis. It's a story of war, adventure, betrayal, romance, and the faith. It's historical fiction set in the midst of the Arian crisis of the 4th century, during the time of the rise of Julian the Apostate, whom St. John Henry Newman had considered to be a shadow of the Antichrist. It's a period of time that many Catholic writers, reflecting on our own period in time right now, especially the last 10 years, have likened to the Arian crisis. So if you want to see how that turned out, then you can start by getting your copy of book 1 of the trilogy, which is called Pia Fidelis, The Two Kingdoms. It's available on Amazon in a Kindle paperback and hardback version, and paperback and hardback through other fine distributors as well. Okay, so that concludes part 4 of 5 of our series on Benepapism, the Munus versus the Ministerium. I hope you look forward to viewing part 5, which should be coming soon to a theater near you. Again, I thank you for your time and attention during this series. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you have found it interesting, and I hope you stay tuned for more. Thank you.